Okay, welcome everybody to our Ideas Seminar. Hopefully you found a lovely place to watch this from and are enjoying a little bit of the air outside as well. Today it is my great privilege to introduce you to Colin Clarke. Colin is a faculty member here at Carnegie Mellon in the Institute for Strategy and Policy. He has a strong political science background. He's also previously worked with the RAND Corporation, and his research really focuses on terrorism, terrorism in the modern age and so on. He's done a lot of work related to the linkage between terrorism, transnational crime, and insurgencies. He's done a lot of work on terrorism and social media, and so on. He's basically briefed people all over DC and is frequently heard from, been quoted in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., being that he's an expert in this particular area. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Colin to talk to you today. So Colin, take it away.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. Thanks everybody for logging in today. I understand people may have webinar fatigue, given at least the pace at which I've been asked to brief since the pandemic started. It's good and bad, right? I mean, you're able to see a lot of things, but at the same time, I don't know, I guess I might miss traveling a little bit, although my kids like having me home. Today I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing in terms of how violent non-state actors, specifically terrorists, are attempting to leverage COVID-19. And this is work that I've been doing really kind of, in my own, just because of my own interest. I published an article in Foreign Policy on this topic, and then this work has also informed a couple of grant proposals with other terrorism researchers out there in the field. And so we'll see what comes from that. But much of this, is something that I think a lot of folks in my field saw coming because of terrorist proclivity to basically capitalize upon any kind of emergency or humanitarian disaster, right? Provision of services are something that at least the more effective terrorist groups do quite well. And so this is no different. They're well organized and prepared and ready to assist and fill key governance gaps. Just more about my background, some of the things that I do, several fellowships and editorial board appointments, published a book last year called After the Caliphate, trying to sketch out some future scenarios for what I think will happen next with the Islamic State. The bottom line up front is that the pandemic has opened up a number of opportunities for violent non-state actors, terrorists, insurgents, and criminal organizations. Again, not really a surprise to anybody that's following this. I think where we see variation is how effective, on a couple of fronts. One, how effective terrorist groups can be in stepping in and filling the void. And a lot of that depends on where they're operating. If they're operating in a state where the government is either unwilling or unable to provide those services, that gives these groups more leverage, more leeway. And what they do with this is essentially attempt to translate it into political legitimacy. You've got groups on the higher end like Lebanese Hezbollah that are a true hybrid in nature. So these are terrorist insurgent groups, but also they have a foot in the health ministry and in the legitimate governance of Lebanon. So those are groups that are well prepared. And a group like Hezbollah already has their own fleet of of ambulances and health clinics and construction company. So they're really a group that's been around for several decades that is able to fill this void quite effectively. When it first happened, I was thinking back to my time at RAND. I'd done a bunch of work for SOCPAC out in PACOM, and we were looking at how violent non-state actors there responded to a range of HADR contingencies, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. One of the more well-known stories was after an earthquake in Pakistan, you had a front group for Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a group that was involved in the Mumbai attack, so very violent, radical Sunni jihadist group, step in through its charity and serve as a kind of front to assist people. And again, you're talking about a state like Pakistan where the government, really doesn't even control the entire territory, especially when you start thinking about areas like the federally administered tribal areas that border Afghanistan, as well as large chunks of kind of major cities, mega cities like Karachi or elsewhere, where you have what I would call kind of sub-state governance or alternative forms of governance, where these groups really command, well-armed militias. They provide education, they provide healthcare. So they are a state within a state in many regards. And when they perform well in the aftermath of natural disasters, they're rewarded with a stronger constituency, with more political legitimacy. And really, in some cases, I'd say in Pakistan and certainly in Lebanon, the government almost kind of depends on these groups' ability to fill the void where they're unable to. The problem becomes when, they rely on them for security provision as well. And so they're almost ceding sovereignty to these groups that are quite violent. And in the case of both Hezbollah and Lashkar-e-Taiba, can drag the state itself into conflict that they wouldn't want to be involved in. With LAT, you think back to the Mumbai attacks and how that brings two nuclear armed nations to the precipice of war, because you have an LAT attack on a country like India, right, one of the more powerful countries in the world. And that's kind of a parallel governance structure there. It was instigated at the behest of ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence. With Hezbollah, think back to July 2006 and the 33-day war with Israel, where the Israelis responded and wiped out quite a bit of southern Beirut, which also is interesting because even though Hezbollah started the conflict, they got credit for rebuilding a lot of the area that the Israelis destroyed. So in some ways, it's counterproductive. We've seen the Taliban step up in Afghanistan already. Late May, the last numbers I saw for Afghanistan were about 12,000 cases of COVID-19. But given the country's inadequate health infrastructure, you can believe that the numbers are far higher than that. This is a country that's going to be ravaged by the coronavirus and will be unable to do much about it. So the Taliban has actually stepped up, has cleared paths and called ceasefires in certain parts of the country to enable health organizations to respond. And given the kind of nature of peace talks in that country now and negotiations geared toward establishing some kind of a power sharing arrangement, this is a key moment for the Taliban to basically show Afghan citizens and civilians that they are capable of doing just as good of job as the government, if not better. Going back to Hezbollah, again, a group that's well positioned to take advantage and capitalize upon their own existing capabilities. Lebanon has experienced a severe economic shocks right now. We know that it's hobbled by corruption, and Hezbollah stepped in and offered all of its health-related resources to the government, and it's given Hezbollah once again the opportunity to kind of shine and show that it's able to care for not just Shia, but also beyond that to Lebanese and to Christians, Maronites, Druze, Sunnis, and others within the country. And so we're likely to see, if Hezbollah does perform well here, coming out of this with quite a boost politically, which is important given the way that this group has expended resources fighting for Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the civil war there. So they've spilled a lot of blood, a lot of treasure, even though a lot of the treasure is vis-a-vis Iran. They've had to lower their recruiting age, even younger than what they're normally used to. And there's been instances where there's been kind of donation boxes put up all around, kind of Hezbollah-held territory, which would suggest that the group is hurting financially. Part of that is, due to the fact that they've been expending resources in Syria. The other part is a result of the maximum pressure campaign, U.S. sanctions targeting Iran, which has a trickle-down effect to Hezbollah's coffers as well. In Syria, you've got the al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, although there's disagreement over how closely linked HTS is with AQ. But in any case, they've been distributing their newsletter, basically attempting to show Syrians how they can protect themselves and their families. Why I think this is really important is because what we're seeing take place right now in Syria, and in fact what we have been seeing in the northwest part of the country in and around Aleppo and Idlib and elsewhere, is jihadi groups attempting to kind of mainstream their ideology and pursue a grassroots political outreach, which essentially I wrote a piece for Reuters, and going back a couple of years now, where I argued that I think what we're seeing there, and this was back when HTS was still Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, after it was Jabhat al-Nusra, it's gone through several rebrandings, where the group is essentially following a Hezbollah model, where they're attempting to maintain their weapons and their militia, but are also seeking to ingratiate themselves into kind of local political councils, conduct dawah or outreach, and really make themselves a fact of life in that country. So when there are political negotiations, they have a voice, they have a say in how things shake out. And so you're essentially having, again, there's debate over how closely linked they are to Al-Qaeda, but some kind of a quasi-jihadist group that could become a permanent feature of the Syrian state for the foreseeable future. And that's got obvious implications for, the threats to the West. So this is a group that, again, they see an opportunity here with COVID-19. The Assad regime notoriously lacks transparency. And if you just look at some of the war crimes and atrocities that the regime's committed against its own people, there's no love lost there, given all the barrel bombings, torture, and whatnot. So I think there's a real opportunity here for non-state actors to increase their kind of market share in one of the few parts of Syria that remain disputed or rebel held. We've seen in Somalia, al-Shabaab taking advantage as well, and kind of disseminating propaganda that says this is crusader forces that brought this into the country, not only Western militaries, but also AMISOM, so the kind of regional African peacekeeping contingency that's there. That's a frequent target of Shabaab, and they use this to recruit new members to spread beyond Somalia's borders into places like Kenya. And there's actually a growing militant movement all the way down the eastern coast of sub-Saharan Africa, reaching into Tanzania, to Mozambique, and to elsewhere. And we're seeing within the last 6 months to a year a real push by groups like Al-Qaeda, but also the Islamic State, to spread out into sub-Saharan Africa. This is happening at the same time that the United States is really drawing down its presence in Africa. There's a lot of questions over, as we pivot and kind of leave the GWAT behind for preparing for a great power conflict and competition with China and Russia, what happens to that already small contingency of special operations forces in the Sahel and West Africa, but also over in the Horn of Africa. And if those forces draw down even further, you're providing an opportunity for these groups to kind of maintain their foothold and potentially grow. And it's not just terrorists, and it's not just insurgents. We've seen groups in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, which has one of the worst outbreaks of COVID-19 in the world. Much of that due to kind of inept leadership, political leadership, but nevertheless, we've had drug trafficking organizations and criminal gangs that have, filled the void, that they've worked to enforce a curfew. And if you've seen some of the messaging coming out from the government, Bolsonaro has essentially said, what do you want me to do? It's not up to me. And so there's a real divide. My best friend actually lives in Sao Paulo. He's a banker down there. And so we talk pretty frequently. And, he's quite cognizant of the haves and the have-nots. And so the messaging from the government is, you're on your own, figure it out or don't. And so these groups are moving in just as they would when governance lacks elsewhere and in other times to fill the void and take advantage, and likely increase their own sense of legitimacy and governance. A lot of this goes back to this whole discussion or debate that we started having after 9/11, when we surveyed the world, kind of investigated how we were, we were caught off guard and attacked by Al Qaeda, this jihadist group that was operating in a safe haven or sanctuary in Afghanistan. And we said, well, where are these others around the world that would qualify as kind of quote unquote ungoverned spaces? We thought about places like the Sahel or the Sinai in Egypt, Southeast Asian archipelagos, the tri-border area in South America, parts of the Caucasus, including the Pankisi Gorge, where we know that violent non-state actors are operating. I actually have never liked this term, ungoverned spaces, and it's probably because I was trained by Phil Williams, one of the first academics to really study transnational organized crime as an academic discipline, along with Louise Shelley back in the early 1990s. But Phil always kind of drilled this into my head that there are no such thing as ungoverned spaces. If they are, they're kind of desert wastelands. What we're talking about are alternatively governed spaces. We just don't like who's governing there, and we don't recognize that form of governance. But there are, in many ways, unwritten rules or etiquette or shadow governance, if you will, in these places. And so many people are often puzzled when groups respond quickly and have the ability to step in and provide kind of healthcare services when they think, well, these are terrorist groups. I thought all they did was kind of plot, plan, and conduct attacks. Well, no. In the areas that they operate, they're actually much more than just terrorist organizations. And they're acutely aware of this kind of contest to win hearts and minds. It's a term that I don't really love either, but you all understand what I'm talking about. And to compete for the quote unquote fence sitters, or those that are still attempting to make up their mind whether or not they'll support the government or the insurgents that rule in a particular AOR. Again, non-state actors see this battle. It's about a battle for public opinion. It's about providing goods, right? The social contract that we've long talked about, and who's able to fulfill that social contract. So by exploiting these governance gaps, these are critical propaganda victories for these groups. And you'll see in the propaganda that they disseminate, them responding and them doing good works in the community, which is very much juxtaposed to the ineptitude on display in governments all around the world. And again, there's all these different areas. If you were to look at individual case studies of how this has happened over time, in Northern Ireland after the Belfast Agreement, and even really starting before that, you had kind of offshoots or splinter groups of the IRA that had formed into something called DAD. It was Direct Action Against Drugs. So they had policed Catholic neighborhoods and decided that they were going to be the ones who kept drugs out and doled out punishment to those suspected of both selling drugs and using drugs. It often meant, at first a very stern warning in the form of a beating. After that, it escalated to being kneecapped, so shot in the knees, and then it would escalate from there, as you could imagine. But that's seen as a form of service to the neighborhood, even if it's what we would recognize as kind of vigilante justice. There was a story a couple of years ago about how in Somalia, Al-Shabaab started a campaign to ban plastic bags. Now, it's counterintuitive and sometimes hard to get through your head, the fact that a group that's responsible for vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices that can literally kill hundreds of civilians, that then at the same time, care about the environment. But I think it's one of the things as analysts that we have to kind of force ourselves to question our assumptions and our preconceived notions of what these groups are, right? They're complex, just like a lot of other organizations that we study. And they are aware of the fact that, this is a popular, this is something that people care about, including in Somalia, right? And that they can show that by looking after the environment, that they can effectively govern. A lot of this comes down to what works at the local level, right? So, the title of the slide's local knowledge, local solutions. What you have is this intimate familiarity with local customs and culture and what resonates at a parochial level. This isn't going to apply to every situation. So what works in the Philippines might not work in Niger, and vice versa. And so these groups on the ground, this is their home turf. They operate there. They know what works. They know what people care about, and they know how to kind of pursue those objectives accordingly. And I'd say for the most part, with the exception of some of the more well-endowed groups, non-state actors generally lack the resources to provide some of the higher end assistance, like medical equipment. If you think about a country like the Central African Republic, there's literally 3 ventilators for the entire country, right? And so they're not going over there doing things like that. But what they can do is warn people about the disease, how to sanitize the areas that they operate in. And when you think about, really the conditions of some of the refugee camps in developing nations, especially in and around conflict zones, I think that's going to be one of the stories that is really going to be devastating to read about. And it's happening already in parts of Northeast Syria and elsewhere. But again, at that point, the kind of international community, the West, the international media has moved on. And because the popular thinking is, well, bad things are supposed to happen in bad places. And so we're not necessarily surprised. At the same time, that does provide an opportunity for these groups that are operating on the ground to show that they do care, right? And it's, again, this kind of cognitive dissonance of how can a group, provide outreach to locals when at the same time they kill civilians and engage in wanton acts of violence. Well, you know what? They do both. What does this get them, right? Dispensing information and advice, offering tips on how to avoid being infected. This shows that they can be a trusted voice on these issues. It also allows them to seize upon kind of propaganda, conspiracy theories, and you can see by just watching what's happened in our own country how much conspiracy theories can resonate. Now, think about a country where literacy rates are extremely low. They live in a society where news is often transmitted by word of mouth. You're probably familiar with the INTs, HUMINT, SIGINT, but I think one of the most effective types of INT in certain populations is what we call RUMINT, rumored intelligence and what people believe. So talking about the origins of the virus, who put it there and how, it can be an effective tool for, jihadist groups and others operating at the local level to turn the population against the West if they weren't already. And again, this is really kind of talking about as the priorities shift elsewhere, as countries all across the world, including our own, struggle mightily to deal with COVID-19 and have to marshal resources to deal with their own domestic populations, there's naturally going to be a turn away from certain hotspots around the world, both in terms of areas where we really just don't have the resources or it's lower on the list of national security priorities, or there's concern about being in zones where COVID-19 is likely to spike. And so withdrawing down forces, withdrawing back troops, this again provides more operating space for violent non-state actors to get out there, to gobble up new territory and to kind of plant their flag in areas where they hadn't beforehand. What do you do about it? I was having a discussion the other day with someone at DOD, and very often we want the silver bullet. We want the quick fix, right? But really, it's the kind of long-term strategy, good governance, which has become a bit of a cliche, right? I can't tell you how many policy reports I read where it's really detailed information. It's a good mixed methods approach, quantitative analysis with some robust case studies. And then you get to the policy recommendations section, and it feels like something of a kind of add-on, like an afterthought, just tacked on to the end. Essentially, these one-line bulleted points of promote good governance, counter corruption, increase the rule of law. Okay, yeah, no kidding. That's the goal, but how do you actually do that in some of these countries? There are certain countries, through our security cooperation and building partner capacity initiatives that we can't work in. Some of it due to Leahy vetting, where there's human rights abuses, others where we just don't have a relationship, or it's more of a CT focus than anything else. And we spend a lot less time developing ministries and defense institutions and the types of activities that are likely to get you a better return on investment in the long run. Instead of what we do, which is a lot more myopic, which is we tend to focus more on kinetic activities. And even there, I spent a lot of my time at RAND working on measurement and evaluation, not only in terms of information operations, but how do you measure the effectiveness of security cooperation? And we have a real struggle with that. What we do is more akin to counting, right? Or going back to the kind of Vietnam era of body counts, right? That's not measurement. That's not evaluation. It's not going to tell you where the gaps are, what the workarounds are, and how to kind of get better at what you're doing. And it's not easy. I don't mean to sit here and suggest that any of this is easy. And I understand with limited resources, you have to figure out where to allocate what you do have and where to work and kind of partner with governments where you think you're actually going to have a lasting impact. So I think that's probably my last slide. I've got a lot more thoughts on this issue. I've been thinking a lot more lately about futures. So I've done some work for the NIC and for ODNI, thinking about kind of what comes next, what's coming down the pike. And I've got a lot of thoughts on how COVID-19 is going to impact several strands of terrorism, different ideologies. Actually giving a talk at Facebook on Friday on the future of terrorism and how I think the coronavirus is going to accelerate these strands. And I think it's going to be all across the board, frankly, because we've seen a lot of far-right extremists, including violent white supremacists, capitalizing on this. Jihadis have as well. And I've got a lot of other thoughts on, so-called conspiracy theorists like QAnon. And one area that I think has gotten short shrift, but that I think we're going to see more of in the future, which is left-wing terrorism or left-wing violence surrounding the environment and animal rights. I think, the future is much like the past. If you look back to groups like the Earth Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front in the 1990s, but individuals that are that feel the need to engage in acts of violence to raise their grievances to a level where governments can no longer ignore them. And that's action surrounding climate change and a bunch of other traditional left-wing topics as well. And that's a challenge too, because there are things that we may all, not all, but many of us may agree with in principle, to do more on climate, to stop animal abuse. And so morally, you may feel good about promoting these causes, and you may be less inclined to call out actors that are willing to kind of go to the fringes to commit that. And I want to be clear too, I haven't seen this manifesting itself yet. This is more of a projection when people have asked me, well, okay, what happens in 3 to 5 years? What's the impact down the line? So I'll stop there and open it up to Q&A, and we can just kind of have a free-flowing discussion for the remaining time.
I'm Margaret Sanger from the University of Arizona.
Hey, Margaret.
Hi. And I teach media and terrorism and looking right now at human rights and the pandemic. So this was all really, really interesting to me. And in some ways, it seems quite logical that, of course, these groups would step in to fill this kind of void. And I'm thinking back like to Hamas. Mm-hmm. In the early days, I remember reading years ago that Hamas kind of established itself by providing what the PLO wasn't. And what
exactly.
So this all makes sense. And of course, they would have an interest, non-state actors, in keeping their own people healthy.
Sure.
They don't want their, troops dying off. But my question is, where's the money coming from? You touched a bit with Hezbollah. and their kind of constraints at the moment. But I'm wondering, because we see in this country that the kind of cost this is, although maybe they're mostly doing kind of low cost, you know, information campaigns or propaganda campaigns, but where's the money coming from?
You mean the money to do the propaganda and IO?
Exactly. Or to even do, are they actually doing physically on the ground, setting up health centers or clinics, or is there that kind of physical manifestation of
Depending where it is, yeah. So in Lebanon they are, but again, Hezbollah is far more advanced than most other militant groups. In Afghanistan, it's really just making way, right, for NGOs and others, and they're scoring points by doing that, of basically saying, look, you have free passage. We're not going to attack you. And if you think about it, in many areas, there's been a kind of a pause on operations. So the security forces haven't been out and about because they've been more reluctant. They've been garrisoned or called back to kind of military bases or large urban centers. So, you know, these groups are expending fewer resources to launch attacks, so they can kind of repurpose funds. And if you just look at the way technology, you know, has advanced, it doesn't cost a lot to run the types of, you know, operations comparatively that a lot of these groups have run over the years. I mean, ISIS is a great example, although they did have quite a robust budget. You know, a good deal of my work toward the end of my time at RAND was on ISIS financing. So you're talking about the richest terrorist group ever. But, you know, with a smartphone and an internet connection, you can really kind of punch above your weight for a non-state actor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you see the argument that's being made that the pandemic is basically God's retribution on people? Is that argument actually enabling or helping support the terror groups to recruit more people faster than they were before?
Yeah, so that's something I think we don't know. I haven't seen the data on recruitment, but my gut tells me that I think for jihadi groups, certainly where I've actually been looking more closely is at white supremacist groups, including white supremacist groups here in the United States that have been very active recruiting. I mean, if you think of quarantine, everybody's home, everybody's online. And one of the issues, we did a webinar for through the work I do at the Soufan Center a couple of weeks ago that was heavily attended by law enforcement, including FBI. And one of the things that we're finding is that the kids are younger than ever. We're talking teens and in some cases preteens, because parents are distracted. They're working remotely and they're balancing that with homeschool. And so the kids that are kind of 11, 12, 13, more self-sufficient are off in their room. They're online. A lot of this is taking place through online gaming platforms. And if you look at the culture surrounding the way white supremacist groups recruit these days, it's this kind of soft pedaling of racism. It starts with a meme. And that's a way to desensitize people. And it's, you know, folks from our generation would look at a meme about the Holocaust and find it repugnant and the way that we should. But younger generations, I don't know if it's because of a lack of education or if this has just become more common, are finding this, white supremacist groups are finding meme culture as an effective way to pull people into the group. And when they are called out on it, it's like, well, I was just joking. That's just a joke, you know what I mean? And so we've seen, my sense is that the first half of 2020 will be a watershed moment for far-right extremists in terms of recruitment, in terms of prolonging their movement. And they're essentially focusing on bringing in the next generation of recruits. And there's this kind of trope or this stereotype of who's a white supremacist, right? It's this kind of redneck type person. And that's no longer true. I mean, to the extent that it ever was. We're seeing, you know, geographic variation. We're seeing kids that are quite tech savvy. And it's really scary. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of overlap with other types of ideologies. David Gartenstein Ross calls it fringe flexibility, where And a lot of this is happening with the incel movement, involuntary celibates, which is another ideology I've been doing a lot of work on lately. Canada just made some moves in terms of passing new laws that qualifies the incel ideology as terrorism. But there's a lot of overlap there between the far right incel movement and some of these other kind of ideologies that have become more popular in the last several years. David?
Thanks, Colin. That was a really interesting sort of talk and overview. I was wondering if you could say something about strategies to respond when the propaganda that's put out, the sort of IO that is being done by these groups, actually does contain elements of truth. And so at least a lot of them, it's not just, the complete, this virus is a hoax, pretend it's nothing at all, you don't have to do anything at all. It's actually, this virus is a real thing that was created to destroy us by the West, and so we have to do these protections. So on the one hand, there's really good public health grounds, especially in these areas that are governance challenged, shall we say, and healthcare challenged. There's good reasons to kind of not want to mess with this, because good advice is actually part of the message.
Yeah.
But of course, it's packaged together as a payload with some really bad messaging. So what tactics or strategies or responses exist when you have both the good and the bad mixing together like that?
That's a great question. I don't think we have good strategies. And certainly, when you think about foreign governments in lesser developed nations, that is a true struggle. And it's what makes these groups so savvy. So if you are talking about a country like Pakistan that really struggles to reach significant swaths of the population as it is, that's a major issue. One of the ways that we try to get around this, and this is something that happened, I'll stay on the Pakistan example, with, kind of rumors surrounding polio vaccinations, because the rumor floating around was, these health workers are actually trying to sterilize you, or this is really the CIA that's looking for high-ranking Al-Qaeda leaders and you can't trust them. And so what we try to do is work through, vetted organizations that have established trust, whether that's kind of Doctors Without Borders or other kind of international NGOs. But again, it's not the writ of the United States to tell these organizations what to do. We've already seen some very public squabbling between, the United States and organizations like the WHO. And the other part of that is these organizations themselves and their workers are vulnerable. If you look at what's happened to, they've been attacked and they've been maligned in a lot of cases. So you're right, it's very difficult. And I think it's something that we struggle with even more broadly, stepping back from COVID and looking at kind of like Russian information operations. Is it a prophylactic approach? And there's some good information there, but I think we're really caught flat-footed when it comes to how do we respond to this. And then when you kind of tie in a lot of the conspiratorial stuff, again, we live in a country where socioeconomically and literacy, these are much higher indicators than they are elsewhere. But I kind of it's hard to look at what percentage of the population in this country believes in some of the stuff that we're seeing, like the fact that Bill Gates, who's the new boogeyman, he's kind of usurped George Soros, is behind all this, or things like the Plandemic video, right? And just go on Facebook and you'll see, or meld in anti-vaxxers, right? It's kind of one of the things that I think COVID has provided is, I've called it a buffet for extremism. Everybody's able to get what they want and to kind of twist this to their own narrative. So white supremacists say this is all about, Jews and minorities and immigrants. And, jihadis say this is all about a plan from God. And so everybody's able to kind of tailor this to their pre-existing worldviews and use it to recruit and to find resonance with the communities that they seek to conduct outreach with. So I think we've got a long way to go, and I'm not necessarily optimistic that we'll be able to figure that out in this country to start with, much less to work with partners overseas that have other challenges, including significant resource challenges, to make progress there. Amelia?
Hi. You actually just hit on some of my questions. I'm a public health researcher, so I've been studying anti-vaccine narratives for the past few years. But I think watching what's happening with COVID, particularly online, or seeing this kind of polarization and politicalization of the anti-vaccine narratives, particularly with things like QAnon.
Mm.
And I think as someone who's not an expert in this kind of stuff, other than, public health and vaccines, it's hard to know how much those two groups are merging or how much it's just like co-opting of these narratives because it's convenient.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I think we're still in the really early stages of this. So to see what comes out on the other side, right? There's this natural lag effect. What I do think is happening is that we're broadening the pool, and you're exposing people that might not have been interested in, right? So maybe they're conspiratorially minded, but they weren't necessarily, interested in anti-government activities or white supremacy. It's bringing all these groups together, and there's kind of a cross-pollination that's happening, and that's what I think I'm most concerned about, because my research looks at the most violent of these individuals and groups. So let's say hypothetically only 0.5% of people actually mobilize to violence. Well, when your pool has increased in aggregate substantially, that 0.5% can mean the difference between 4 attacks in a year and a dozen or 15. So that's a major concern that I have, as well as what I talked about before, this kind of fringe flexibility, which this kind of younger generation is more amenable to. And there's a number of interesting cases where we've seen people kind of ideology shopping, right? Trying on these different ideologies till they find one that fits. I mean, we've had, radical vegans become white supremacists. We had a case there's a guy named Andrew Anglin, referencing there. There's a case in Florida of a young guy named Devin Arthurs who was a neo-Nazi and then converted to Islam and then murdered his roommates because they were insulting Islam. So, these jumps that you think are, wow, how do you go from one to the other? This is happening, I think, at least in my observation, more than it has in the past. And I think groups like QAnon, which I'm really still trying to wrap my arms around, a good long piece in the Atlantic last week that was quite scary in its prediction, saying it's going to be enmeshed almost similar to like a religion would be. How are these groups kind of recruiting or socializing their ideas? And to David's point, like, are we prepared to counter them, particularly when some of these ideas that they're floating out there does contain some truthful elements, but the rest is twisted. So, one of the things that I've been thinking about, more frequently is how do people like me that are kind of security researchers link up with people like you that have public health knowledge and start tackling these problems together. Coming from RAND, that was quite easy because we were all housed in the same place. But that's something that I'd like to make a priority of as a researcher, is kind of knocking down some of these artificial barriers and working across disciplines more closely, because our adversaries do it and mingle freely. We have kind of rice bowl or jurisdictional issues more so. And that's less of an issue at a place like CMU, where I think it is more decentralized and people are work across disciplines. But I'm talking about kind of academia and the research world writ large, where everybody kind of stays in their lane more so. But I think it would go a great way toward helping us to understand what we're seeing and really preparing for what I think is coming next. And again, not to, I try to be a very kind of sober in my assessments, and I don't consider myself a threat inflator. But in preparing for this talk I'm giving at Facebook on Friday, and looking at some of the trends that I've seen emerging, I am quite concerned for what 3 to 5 years will bring in this country.
Will that be a public talk?
It's internal, unfortunately.
Okay.
But what I've done actually is, as I kind of prepared a lot of my talking points, I packaged them into a piece that'll probably be published by Slate before the end of the week. So it'll be online.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Please, you can see my my contact information up there. If this is a topic that you're working on, please feel free to kind of reach out and share your research or continue the dialogue. Kathleen, did you have something?
Do you think that after kind of everyone starts going back and working and so on, that we will not only get more attacks, but more violent attacks?
What's the hypothesis behind why we would see more violent attacks?
That's what I'm asking you, is do you think we will?
Yeah, I think we're likely to see an increase in frequency. You know, personally, I'm quite concerned for November around the elections because, you know, if the president loses, I think that there's probably a good chance that we're likely to see some civil unrest or violence that we haven't seen on a scale that we will in this country. Particularly if there's something said about, you know, the election was rigged or whatever. I think either way, you know, if President Trump loses, there's going to be some really negative fallout in terms of you know, domestic groups causing harm. The other thing that I've been talking about and thinking a lot about lately, and I've been engaging with various government agencies, is I think what happens post-COVID is an acceleration for terrorist groups, particularly transnational groups, to pursue biological weapons, because the impression is that the United States is not prepared to deal with that, and I think that that's likely true. Now, these groups have pursued biological weapons beforehand. I mean, Al-Qaeda and ISIS have pursued a range of WMD, radiological, chemical, etc. And there's a difference between intent and capability. But if you think about the combination, and I used a really good book for my social media technology and conflict course this year, Audrey Kurth Cronin's new book, Power to the People, about, you know, how terrorists are kind of super empowered now with access to certain technologies. So if you take a handful of technologies, the way that drones are advancing, various other kind of commercial off-the-shelf technologies, think about the advances in gene editing tools, things like CRISPR. I think the likelihood that we see some kind of an attack along those lines in the next 5 years increases, you know, even if the attack's not successful in terms of kind of what a terrorist group would want in terms of lethality or casualty counts, the psychological damage, which is a big part of terrorism, could be significant. And so that's something that I think gets kind of bumped up in terms of priority for these groups to really try to pursue some kind of biological weapon at a scale and pace that maybe wasn't as much of a priority before, just because of, you know, the panic it will induce. Margaret.
Thanks. Just one final quick question. Well, for me, with all these, I love this fringe flexibility concept. And with young people, again, it's kind of makes logical sense. They're spending more time online and checking this stuff out. So is there do you have indications that actual numbers are increasing of people who are, you know, willing to actually take action? As you say, there's that small number that will step over into active extremism. Do we have any sense that that may be happening, or?
So at an unclassified forum, I can't, you know, I would say no. All I would say is I think that we're continuing to collect data on that. And again, you know, what we see manifesting in the first half of 2020, we will see the kind of output from in the latter half or early 2021. But what's percolating right now, I think, is what I'm most fearful of. And, you know, a lot of this has to do with kind of access that I have to, you know, the intelligence community and other kind of law enforcement agencies. And much of it, again, is largely anecdotal at this point. But even if you just kind of connect the dots and you look at some of the data, right? So we know that online gaming communities and platforms are a huge place, if not the place, where far-right and white supremacist groups look to recruit. And if you look at the sales, the spike in sales around online gaming, and see how many more people are actually playing and it's just logical that the numbers are going to swell. And I've had people question, well, what do you mean an 11 or 12-year-old's being recruited into groups like this? That's crazy. Actually, it's not. There's folks like Christian Picciolini, who is a former white supremacist, who's now got his own NGO, and he wrote a book, I think it's like Life After Hate or something like that. He now speaks openly about recruiting tactics of white supremacist organizations. He was recruited at 11 years old, and that's not uncommon. The other piece that is a bit concerning is the fact that you've got people with certain worldviews that are now in charge of homeschooling their children. And so what are they passing on to their kids on a daily basis, whether intentionally or unintentionally? It kind of shapes their worldview at a very critical time in their life, and combined with others, whatever their role models are, that are now kind of taking the place of formal education. I think that's another thing that's incredibly difficult to measure in the moment, but that, when we are experiencing a crisis 2 or 3 years from now, we can kind of look back upon and go, oh, well, it makes a lot more sense that these are the times when that happened. As someone that studied jihadi groups and kind of civil wars and insurgencies, we talk about MAMs, military-aged males, right? The group of concern of 18 to 30-year-olds. So if you look at that kind of group right there, combine that with if we're likely to see a prolonged recession, lack of opportunities, and I think you've got a pretty toxic combination.
Thank you so much. All this was really, really fascinating.
And I would say that goes beyond that last piece, that goes beyond the United States. And I spent the whole month of June last summer in The Hague. I'm a fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. And I think that applies to Europe as well. And you think about countries like Greece and other countries that have kind of just gotten through austerity and they're about to go back in for another round. What does this do for groups like Golden Dawn or, groups in Italy or elsewhere? Doing a bunch of work with Cynthia Miller-Idris right now, who's an expert down at American University, looking at what's happening in Germany. And I think there's a cycle of violence too, with kind of jihadi attacks and a growing right wing in Germany and elsewhere, right? There's this kind of yin and yang where one fuels the other. So that's something to keep on our eyes as well. And what happens politically in these countries if populists become, take more power politically, and the perpetuation of this concept that, immigrants brought this here, and that's why we're suffering. And it really lends credence to a lot of the narratives that these groups have already been pushing. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Look, we told you that this was going to happen. What we need now more than ever is to batten down the hatches, to close our borders, to move back to, an all-white ethno-state. And so those groups receive a huge boost from what's happened here, and I think they're likely to capitalize on it. I wish I had better news. This is just, and really, I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that things don't trend in this direction, or if they do, that it's not as severe. But a lot of the kind of indicators that I'm seeing lead me to be pretty pessimistic on where things are heading in terms of political violence or ideologically motivated violence. I think we're getting close to pushing up against time, so I want to thank everybody for attending, and please do feel free to reach out. You can see my contact info up on the screen. I'd be happy to continue this conversation over email or over Zoom. And it's an area where I think there's going to be continued need for research. So happy to collaborate or talk with folks that are working on similar issues, especially those that come at it from a different perspective than me. I'm also very happy for someone to kind of, question some of the things I've said today, because I think it is important to question our own assumptions. And if anybody's got a rosier scenario, I'd surely like to hear it. All right, everybody, take care, stay healthy. Kathleen, thanks so much for hosting me. I really enjoyed my time here, and I hope to hear from some of you in the near future.